Okay, so in the interest of time, I want to get started. Thank you for those of you who are here joining us today. My name is Erin Kobetz, and I'm the Vice Provost for Research and Scholarship. And one of the very best parts of my role is supporting ULINK, which is the opportunity to bring together interdisciplinary scholars around a common purpose. This year's ULINK efforts have all been organized around race and anti-Black racism. And in order to continue the conversation beyond the projects that we fund, we've been working with individual schools and colleges across the university to highlight work within them that also focuses on race and anti-Black racism, but may not be supported by ULINK itself. Our intent in having these conversations is to try to begin to connect scientists and scholars and those who pursue creative endeavors who are working in shared spaces independently with one another. Because when we're tackling an issue such as race and anti-Black racism and social equity more broadly, we really need the combined creative minds of many to advance a complex solution for a really complicated problem. This is our second ULINK out of school. Our first was at Frost. It was one of the best days of my academic career. And so I really look forward to learning more from the Frost faculty about the work that they're engaged in, because it is so powerful and so very inspiring. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Carlos Abril, the research dean for the Frost School of Music and my very good colleague and friend. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Erin. And good afternoon, everyone. My name is Carlos Abril, and I am a professor of music education at the Frost School of Music. And this, in my capacity as research dean, I'm thrilled to introduce this second talk on race, diversity, and equity, and really to highlight the work of Frost. When you think of the Frost School of Music, the first thing that might come to mind might not be research and scholarship, but I assure you that we are doing all sorts of work that centers around traditional research as well as scholarly work and creative work. And I think there's some interesting points of intersection where our work surrounding race, anti-racism, diversity, and equity really might find new avenues for us to find interdisciplinary collaborators to continue this work. And so this is a chance for us to highlight the different kinds of work that we do at the Frost School of Music, representing different epistemological orientations and traditions. And so it is my pleasure to introduce this semester's panel. We're going to have a Professor Melvin Butler from the Department of Musicology talk about his research exploring cultural flows through Haitian improvised music. We're going to have two of our other faculty members who are collaborating with somebody in another department, in the history department. These would be Professors Edmund Abaca, Jeffrey Buchman, and Valerie Coleman, who are doing some really exciting and innovative work with creativity, technology, and connecting it to history. My colleague in music education, Professor Zdzinski, has been interested and working on work related to special needs learners in the music classroom. And of course, that has many intersections and resonance with the work of equity and access in school music programs. And finally, Professor Brian Lynch, who comes to us from the Department of Jazz, and he is going to be sharing with you one of his latest recording projects. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Professor Melvin Butler.
Thank you, Carlos. It's great to be here. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here, of course, and we'll get underway. All right. I'd like to talk today about some of my work in progress that has to do with the connections really between jazz, as we understand the term to conventionally denote this genre of African-American derived music in the US, and jazz as a Haitian Creole term. So I'm very much interested in these kinds of blendings and the back and forth, the transnational dimensions of popular music in the United States and Haitian popular music as well. And just to put a little bit of this in context, As a musicologist, we often we find ourselves grappling with music and something else. And the things that come after the and, in my case, would be, well, number one, a word like flow. I'm very much interested in the connections, migratory and historical flows that music helps to facilitate and perhaps regulate. Music and meaning, how music is made meaningful in different kinds of social, political, and regional geographical contexts. And then music and positionality. By positionality, I simply mean the performance of position, how people position themselves in society, in their communities, perhaps even in a global network through the music that they make or compose or improvise or perform. And then also the connections between improvisation and composition, both as musical practices, but also looking at them sort of in a metaphorically extended way in terms of how people navigate sort of their way through life as well. I mean, then those pictures at the bottom of the slide there are just a kind of gesture to this African America Haiti connection that has fascinated me. And I think I found that over the past 25 years or so, I've been perhaps unwittingly chipping away at this research project through both my performance career and also the work that I do as a teacher and scholar. I should say that I myself am self-identify as an African American, born and raised in Kansas City, born in Wichita, Kansas, raised in Kansas City, Kansas, and I've done research in Haiti, but I don't have any family connection there that I know of. Unless you go back several generations, maybe you find some ancestors, and so that's added a really interesting dimension for me and animated my work, perhaps in some ways as a quest for identity and meaning in terms of how I position myself in the world as well. And I'm so thinking about jazz as a transnational or African diasporic phenomena. I'm immediately reminded of Haitian musicians or musicians in the United States and Canada of Haitian descent, people like Joey Omisil, a Haitian Canadian saxophonist, Godwin Louis, and Jean Caz, who's based right here in New Orleans. And many of these musicians have used their Haitian heritage to influence the music that they record and perform in live concerts. And so that I've been very fascinated with the historical underpinnings of this modern day phenomena. This all began for me, and I'm going to read a little bit here and sort of go back and forth between reading and talking more casually. But back in 1994, while living in New York City, I began a 3-year stint working as a saxophonist in the horn sections of various compa groups or Haitian dance bands, such as Phantom and Tabu Combo. And while working with Tabu Combo, I noticed that band members expressed an affinity for the jazz I knew best, especially bebop style melodic lines. And they wanted me to implement that style into the horn lines that I was composing and arranging for the band while we were out on tour. They admired the virtuosity of African-American jazz masters such as Charlie Parker and John Coltrane and helped to set themselves apart from rival bands by showcasing horn arrangements that could come across to listeners as intricate and difficult. And just to give you a sense of that, here's just a short snippet of a horn line that I composed for Tabu Combo while I was on the road with them in the 1990s. This was sort of like take two, the first one that I composed for them. They rejected because it sounded too Haitian. They wanted something, as they put it, that represented my music. So it was during this phase of my career while touring with Tabu Combo, before I became a musicologist, that I really started to ponder the role of music in strengthening intra-diasporic relationships between Haitian and African-American performers. Yves Joseph, one of Tabu Combo's founders, has noted, we've always been influenced by all different kinds of music because our goal is to be international. We've always been criticized by the purists of compa music, saying that Tabu Combo is like more of a rock compa band. And this is exactly what we want, to put us onto the international map. And those kinds of critiques are reminiscent of those that were launched against other groups back as early as the 1940s, when the incorporation of foreign styles led some observers to challenge the purity and authenticity of Haitian dance bands. Once the members of Tabu Combo arrived in the United States in the 1970s, the influence of African-American popular music became more profound. And you can see here even on some of the album covers that they were doing in the 1970s. Where they're sort of like what nods to Earth, Wind and Fire, the Commodores, where they were really trying to reach out to an African-American market. But my primary focus really, today, and I think in the maybe my third book, once I finish book number 2, is really to think about this with regard to the music that's often referred to as jazz. And while New Orleans is often referred to as the birthplace of jazz, scholars now recognize that they recognize the influence of musical styles from elsewhere in the United States and also from a variety of Caribbean cultural spaces. While the myth of a unilinear development from New Orleans to the rest of the world persists in some circles, historians now find it fairly obvious that the historical ties and geographical proximity to events and places in the so-called New World require that we place jazz in a much broader analytical context. A focus on what many observers term Haitian jazz or Creole jazz or jazz Creole represents a relatively new term in my scholarly career, but as I say, I think I've been chipping away at it for quite some time now. I felt drawn to this topic for a number of reasons. Perhaps it's my way of bringing the past into the present as I work out my own sense of identity and connection to both the African-American musical communities I call home and also the wider diasporic and transnational sphere. The International Jazz Festival in Port-au-Prince provides an interesting case study for understanding some of this. And that's a festival that happens every year that I've been really that I've attended and am interested in revisiting once this pandemic subsides a bit more. Many scholars, such as Michael Largy in his book Vodou Nation, have underscored the historical connections between Haitian and African-American composers, political activists, cultural commentators, and prominent African-American figures such as W.E.B. Du Bois and James Weldon Johnson and Zora Neale Hurston they saw Haiti as an inspiration for artistic creations and political stances that made reference to Haiti's history as the first Black-led independent nation in the hemisphere. Many African Americans even viewed Haiti as an alternate homeland in the first half of the 19th century. And Booker T, and they borrowed in turn from Booker T. Washington's ideas about technical education. One of the interesting byproducts of the US occupation of Haiti, 1915 to 1934, 1934 was the emergence of jazz introduced to urban Haitians by US troops. But there were other avenues of influence as well. From the early 20th century, many elite Haitians had begun sending their children abroad to study. Young Haitian musicians in Europe began sending their children, they found avenues for cross-cultural collaboration and jazz improvisation. For example, Haitian saxophonist Manfred Coxito worked with African-American violinist and band leader Will Marion Cook in London in 1919. And Paris was a significant source of jazz exposure as Haitians there brought back to Haiti dances such as Charleston, along with knowledge of Black musical styles from the United States, which had gained popularity among the French. Saxophone Bertin Depestre Sarnave was a major figure. His group Jazz de la Coupoule was the first Haitian band to record. Sarnave found inspiration from New Orleans-born saxophonist Sidney Bechet, with whom he worked in both London, with whom he worked in London. Haitian musicians who returned home brought back with them their knowledge of jazz styles and helped to disseminate them to other musicians in Haiti. And I should also mention that jazz groups like Jazz des Jeunes, and there's some slippage here with this term jazz as we use the term in English and jazz in Haitian Creole, where the groups would sometimes use the English word, and sometimes they would use the Creole word. With Jazz des Jeunes, you can see here it's jazz, in the English use of the term. So it's sort of like jazz of the youth, super jazz of the youth, which is, but I believe that the term jazz here is signifying not simply a stylistic preference for an imported idiom into Haiti, but rather a reappropriation of jazz with Haitian aesthetic sensibilities. Gage Averill writes about this. He states that the power relations between the United States and Haiti during the occupation certainly helped to popularize the American dance music, but the Haitian partisans of jazz also seem to be exploring an African-American musical kinship, a relationship between musics of diasporic intimacy. On this brief recording from the 1940s, you can hear the influence of big band jazz from the United States, as well as the sounds of a Haitian popular music genre known as the meringue. So you'll have to go find that to listen to more. That's just a little tease, I suppose. But I like to make mention of these historical connections, the musical connections between Haiti and African America, as I mentioned, because of my own identity as an African American Haitianist scholar um, who has on more occasions than I can recount had to explain my ethnic, racial, and national identities in response to assumptions that a kin-based relationship is what draws me to the Caribbean. But despite my personal bond, desire to bond via a shared diasporic identity, it's usually the case that a strong sense of national identity, we are Haitian, you are American, prevails in my interactions with Haitians, both in Haiti and the United States. Second, it's worth mentioning too that my encounters with Haitians my first encounters came not in Haiti, with Haitians came not in Haiti, but in Boston, where I went to college as an undergrad, and then in New York, and now here in Miami, where I'm hoping to kind of leverage this geographical location in order to really elaborate and expand upon this kind of project. During my tours with Tabu Combo, I also, there's lots of experiential similarities between what I saw at concerts and what I see in the religious context that I often do research in as well. And so that's also animated my work. So thinking about the narratives of jazz history, and I know I don't have a lot of time, so I'll try to sort of sum up where I'm hoping to kind of go with this, I suppose, is that in terms of the narratives of New Orleans being the birthplace of jazz, for example, I sort of struck by this 2013 article in the Miami Herald by Jacqueline Charles, who writes that if New Orleans is the city where jazz was born, then Haiti is the place where it is being reborn, but with a distinct Caribbean flavor. Called Creole jazz, it often joins traditional Vodou rhythms, conga drums, and classical jazz chords. And that article served to announce the Port-au-Prince International Jazz Festival, which would be headlined that very year, which was supposed to be headlined that very year by saxophonist Branford Marsalis. And he was, in many respects, a fitting choice because of his New Orleans roots. But he's, I think, also emblematic of the global and African diasporic connections the festival's organizers sought to highlight. It was first held in 2007. And it's heralded as a bridge to the world, a way of improving Haiti's cultural visibility and promoting Haiti as both a giver and receiver of valuable musical resources. One of the interesting things about that Miami Herald article is that they cast jazz in Haiti as a forgotten musical treasure, as an artifact that is only recently being reborn, but with a distinct Caribbean flavor. But of course, neither jazz, as the term is used to denote African-American derived improvisatory jazz, genres such as bebop and swing, nor jazz, referring to Haitianized versions of the same, represent a new phenomenon in Haiti. Pianist Jelly Roll Morton, who claimed to be the inventor of jazz, was of Haitian descent and had strong family ties to the practice of Vodou. And there are many other examples as well of the sort of the Caribbeanization of Franco New Orleans music. And lastly, I should mention that, there, in terms of, sort of archival type evidence of these kinds of connections, I mentioned that both American Marines and transmigratory Haitian elites brought jazz recordings and a cosmopolitan musical knowledge from the United States, France, and elsewhere into Haiti throughout the 1940s and 50s. And this was a trend that continued with the International Jazz Festival. But Gage Averill had sort of recently done a research project where he took recordings that were made by Alan Lomax back in the 1930s. And it's really fascinating because some of these that he compiled are, they have the word jazz in their title. And you get a real sense of just how far back this kind of influence goes. And perhaps a kind of mutual influence between Haiti and the United States. This is a track called Go Naive that Alan Lomax recorded in 1937 by a group that was called Surprise Jazz or Surprise Jazz. Yeah, so that gives you a little glimpse, and something that was what 80 years ago or something. My math is not good there, but it gives you a sense. And so what's fascinating for me are just the ways that this sort of legacy of jazz in Haiti is kind of being maintained, sustained, sort of maybe reconfigured by a new generation of young jazz artists, like some of those I mentioned at the beginning, and how African-American performers as well, right here in Miami, are sort of becoming part of these networks that no longer look at jazz as solely containing musical characteristics that stem from the United States, but that sort of wear the perfume in perhaps a more obvious way of a Caribbean heritage in particular. As I mentioned, I went to the Port-au-Prince Jazz Festival 10 years ago, and so this is kind of a fitting time to be giving this talk. And I went there with Aaron Goldberg, who is a jazz piano player, some other musicians there. That's Harvel Nakundi, who's right here in Miami, and I'm forgetting the name of the bass player, who's also Brian Lynch probably knows who that is. I'm spacing on his name. But we went and Aaron called this group the sort of Haiti, New York jazz connection. And we went and performed at the festival, but then we went throughout the country and did some workshops on jazz for different schools, public schools there in Haiti. And it was a really rewarding experience where it also reinforced my own desire to kind of continue along this thinking. And as I mentioned, I'm sort of hoping to pick it back up in the near future. So I think that's a good stopping place for now. I could say a lot more of that, but I certainly look forward to your questions and comments. If there are any.
Brian, were you about to say something?
I don't know if I'm allowed to ask a question.
Absolutely, please do.
No, wow, that's so interesting. I couldn't figure out who that bass player was, Melvin.
Yeah, it's gonna come to me after this is over
Yeah.
with. I'll Google him. That's a shame. I'm
But this is so interesting to me, and all that music sounds so good. And I know the work of course, the modern players like Godwin and John, and we should also say something about Obed Calvaire, who's one of the greatest jazz drummers.
That's who that
in the world.
is. I think that's Obed there. Is that not?
Well, he's drummer. That's the drummer, right?
Yeah. So, but yeah, then why would Obed and Harvel be in the same?
Yeah, no, I think that was somebody different. But anyhow, what I wanted to just I'm so interested in this, but I'm also, I to me some of it's reminiscent of some other things that I know a little bit, maybe not a lot about, having to do with the interchange with jazz and Dominican music, for instance. And I got a lot of that through hanging around with Mario Rivera, for many years, and who was kind of like was in a sense a certain kind of godfather, and really somebody who had a lot of like memory of the tradition of that, going back to, I think, around the same era that you're talking about. And maybe
Absolutely.
I don't know if you can speak to that at all, and also to a lot of some of the older music that you played also makes me wonder about the influence of Cuban music on this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, all those connections are there. I mean, and certainly the Dominican Republic, which shares an island with Haiti, right? And so a lot of Haitian popular music was, I mean, for example, the Haitian meringue that I mentioned kind of comes out of, compa, the popular music that I play. That's really, a kind of, sort of an elaboration on Dominican merengue, a sort of slowed down version of it in many ways. But the thing is that I think in among scholars, there has already been a lot of emphasis on what was sometimes called the Latin tinge in jazz, sort of, the sort of the Cuban influence and things like that. Haiti has sort of gotten under acknowledged in a lot of this,
Very much so.
these narratives.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. But there are a lot of connections between the sort of Spanish speaking Caribbean and the Francophone or Creolophone Caribbean. And I guess I see myself as trying to bring out some of these too often neglected lines of influence. But yeah,
it's
Paul Austerlitz is another ethnomusicologist. He might have taught here at one point, but Paul Austerlitz, he's a bass clarinet player and saxophonist who's like done research in the Dominican Republic and Haiti. I don't know if do you know him by any chance?
I do know him.
He's got like he just put out like a 3 CD compilation called something like Underneath the Water. I just did a review of it, but he's talking a lot about these connections as well.
He's written extensively about Haitian music. He teaches, I think, at Gettysburg College.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. is there with Eddie Palmieri. Um, I,
Mel,
I think the Haitian music is underrepresented in the narrative of Cuban music too, especially since the Oriente, the eastern part of Cuba, is very close to Haiti.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Melvin, I don't know if you're seeing this is great, but I see some questions that have
Ah,
come in from our
Oh,
participants. Melvin, I don't know if you see them or you want me to feed a question to you.
that's fine. I don't, I know it looks like I think I may have gone a little too long, so I don't want to take up the time from other
No,
presenters, but
Eva
I'm happy
said we
to.
have a couple minutes. You might be able to answer one of the three questions that have been posed.
Okay.
Do you see them
Oh,
in the Q&A?
I do see them now. Yeah, I think in answer to Dean Berg's question about potential that I see for further melding of Caribbean and jazz styles. I mean, oh my gosh, it's it's through the roof. There's all kinds of potential here, and I think it's happening. There are musicians who are doing it, and hopefully I have the privilege of being one of the people to write about it. Before somebody else snatches up this really fantastic topic. And there probably are people who are writing about it as well. I just haven't had time to look into it. But I mean, what a great location to be in to talk about this very thing. I mean, New Orleans is another fantastic city, but Miami, here we are, basically in the Northern Caribbean, with all of this commingling of Black ethnicities and Latino ethnicities, where all this music is happening. And so I think it challenges us in a healthy way to think perhaps in new ways about improvisatory music, about Black and improvisatory music, and maybe also to problematize jazz. I mean, like I don't even know what the term means sometimes anymore, especially if you think about it in this kind of diasporic context. But I think it's a much broader. The possibilities are much broader than we might have been imagining a lot of times. And I can sort of dovetail into some of these other questions as well. Like Dave Major asks, what do you think African American jazz musicians have incorporated or should incorporate from jazz? Right. Yeah. I think there are, I think there's probably always been a diversity of rhythmic feels that make their way into jazz recordings. We often hear about Dizzy Gillespie, Chano Pozo in the 1950s and the sort of Cuban influence on jazz, the so-called Latin jazz phenomena. But if you think about like musicians like Miguel Zenon, for example, you get the sort of Puerto Rican influence, the playing and the bomba that's making its way into his recordings. There are also jazz musicians as well, like many of them who have Caribbean heritage who are using that. What I'd like to see more of is sort of African American musicians who maybe don't have that same kind of connection via their family to the Caribbean, but maybe drawing on Caribbean styles as well. Maybe more partnerships. I remember Roy Hargrove did a record. I don't think he did it very successful a few years ago. It was called, like several years ago, it was Havana, something like that, where he I think he recorded it in Cuba. Brian, you probably know this one. And I didn't think that I didn't think it was all of that successful of a sort of musical collaboration, but it's a model for the kinds of potential that we have, I think, for doing that. And I know my time is up now, so
Thank you so much, Professor Butler. I really appreciate it. So interesting, especially with all the connections in our school, the research happening at our university, and also the communities, the Miami community as well as the broader community. Thanks so much. So it is my pleasure to introduce our next speakers. This is a interdisciplinary collaboration between professors at the Frost School of Music, Professors Valerie Coleman and Jeffrey Buchman, as well as a professor from the Department of History, Edmund Abaka. So I welcome them to share their fascinating work that they're collaborating on right now. So I'll turn it to you.
Thank you so much. Good. So why don't I, first of all, I just want to express my gratitude to my other two colleagues on this. The ability to do this research with them and learn and grow so much has been a really special endeavor for me. So I thank you both. If it's okay, I'll jump right in and give you all a sense of the research we've been doing. And let me share my screen. All right, so I have been in the process of doing research into the integration of extended reality, or we also call it mixed reality, into the performance of opera and classical music. I, in October of 2019, attended a concert by Valerie Coleman where she performed her composition, Wish Sonatine for flute and piano. I was so deeply moved by the history and human experience that was brought to life by the music she created, as well as by her powerfully riveting performance of the work. Sometimes music plays your soul like an instrument, and for me, this was one of those moments. Her composition evokes incredibly strong emotion and imagery of the middle passage, and I sense great potential for the application of the research I was doing in mixed reality to what she had created in Wish Sonatine. So in December of 2019, we were awarded a Magic Leap Initiative grant from the Office of the Provost to begin first phase research for this project. With our focus now on the design work of our second phase, I've been incredibly inspired by the sculptures of African artist Kwame Akato Bamfo, and my great hope is that we might be able to bring him onto the team to contribute his voice to the work we're doing. You'll see here, I was so moved by his ability through Akam Portraits of the Dead to force us to consider each individual life that's been impacted, that was impacted, that still is impacted by the African slave trade. His sculptures, they really have the ability to sear humanity into our hearts. Here in this sample from our phase one work, you will see what we've created technically as placeholders in the animations for how I envision using the contribution of an artist such as Kwame in our project. And as you may have noticed from this sample excerpt, that is a view through the Magic Leap goggles. And as you may have noticed, the work was not being performed in a concert hall, but was rather being experienced in my own home. And that's an additional aspect of what we're creating, the ability to take experience that we're making to anyone in the world through virtual reality as well, rather than just limiting it to those who may attend an exhibit or performance in person. A critical member of our team is Dr. Edmund Abaka of the History Department of the College of Arts and Sciences, who through his expertise in African history and the Middle Passage is helping to guide the work of our project. Moved by his research on slave forts, castles, and dungeons of the Atlantic slave trade, in our next design phase, we will create an introduction to this whole experience where one hears Fred Dagar's poem, Wish, which was the inspiration for Valerie's composition, spoken as we pass through the underground tunnel of a slave castle, leading us to the door of no return. Here's the audio recording we made for this introduction.
I wish those tall ships at Africa's shore had dropped anchor to plant crops there. Sugarcane, tobacco, cotton, and coffee. Instead, they filled the hungry bellies of hulls with Africans and set sail, wanting nothing from that big place that wasn't diamond, gold, ivory, flesh. I wind the clocks back and turn the ships around, Not a single bullet, whip, or cutlass sound to deafen our ears for centuries. No Atlantic road of bones from people dumped into the sea to form a wake.
So I hope you can see both the vision and the potential for the work we're doing. And with that, I'd like to turn things over to my colleagues, Valerie Coleman and Dr. Edmund Ibaka, to share their insights into the project.
Thank you so much, Dr. Buchman, for taking this work and transforming it in a way that is synergistic and is allowed to reach audiences in a way that just telling the history outright might not otherwise do. And so I know that with this, the way that is being portrayed now, using technology, I know that it is my role to be that storyteller and talk about this work in such a way that we have that background and knowledge. And it really all starts with that poem by Dr. Fred Degar, who is a professor of literature at UCLA. Dr. Betsy Crone, a flute professor at Virginia Tech, came to me just right after I had my first child, my first and only child, Lisa Naomi. And she said, I'd like to commission you to write a sonata for flute and piano. And she said, you have to use this poem. At the time, I was not necessarily interested in writing about a page in history that was so dark. Because I just had a child and I wanted to enjoy that moment. But when I read the poem, I realized that it reminded me of my role as a creator to bring this music to life, to become a storyteller once again. So in reading the poem, you started to go into the history of things, the tall ships at Africa's shore. Did we know that you could smell the ships before you saw them? They dropped anchor to plant crops there, sugarcane, tobacco, cotton, and coffee. Those were the products that are kind of the different version of the Silk Road in its own right. So all of a sudden, this vast history, this world was opened up to me in such a way that I knew I had to apply music as a literal tool to portray all the moments. And so with any good story, you of course have different chapters of books. And so that first chapter to me is all about the tall ships that are coming. This sound that you have with the piano, and the piece is 13 minutes long, so we would not be able to play it for you right now, but the sound of the piano giving that long sense of opening and wailing, along with the flute playing these long hollow notes that are almost ghost-like, depicting the horns of the ships coming in the distance. If you heard those sounds and you smelled the ships, you knew that it was your last time on your home soil, everything that you knew was home. So if you were in chains, what do you do next? You fight. And so the next section became a way of showing what struggle looks like and what struggle sounds like. And for a flute that is mainly known as a classical instrument, I had to take it and transform it in such a way that would depart from all Western knowledge of the instrument and go right to what is the core of grief and struggle. And so you hear different sounds of wailings and shrieks from the flute that turn eventually into the sound of being on the open seas. And with that, you hear a boat that's on the open seas, but I'd like to think that there was a sense of wonder of where are we going? What are we doing here? How are we going to survive? And the rhythm of the waves against the boats creating this I knew that little motif had to be developed into something that allowed for us to get that imagery of sailing on the water. It said that all the different tribes on the ships were not allowed to be together, because if they were, they would form a mutiny. So all the different tribes, they were mixed up and interspersed. And during that time, that's when different languages were exchanged, and different customs and cultures and songs and rhythms that then became what we know as jazz and the blues and spirituals. So one of the things that one could do when you're on the ship, you had many different choices of reclaiming your sovereignty. You could starve yourself to death. You could jump overboard. You could try to form a mutiny and be killed. But one thing that disturbed me most about this story was the idea of the fact that children were often thrown overboard, because you can't control a toddler from crying. Newborn babies, they were prized possessions because they were currency. But if a baby survived, it was an amazing thing. So within the music, I depicted a moment where a woman was giving birth to a child. That moment of anguish, of pain, of delivering, and then that moment of pure love depicted by a single note. And then that moment of dread, knowing that that baby would be taken away from you. And in this music, I thought about the idea of how it connects automatically to the amount of grief that we share into spirituals. And so I introduced this melody, and I'll sing it to you, just a hum. Da, 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 da. Da, 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 da. And that moment where you see that baby and you know it's going to be taken away from you, what do? You fight. And so we go back, we return to this motif of shrieks and fighting and just, the forearm of the piano player slamming down on the piano to create those crashing sounds. But then within the music, the vignette changes, and it comes to modern times through the use of this Afro-esque rhythm, this da-dum bum ba-dum ba-da-dum ba-dum bum ba-dum ba-da-dum. I took that melody, I took that rhythm, and then I flipped it and used both of them together to create this composite rhythm in the left and right hand of the piano that really started to create a groove that showed that we're back on the seas, but in a different way this time, going through time. And we're looking at the spirituals and the blues and how it turns into hip hop, how it turns into jazz, how it turns into all of these American song forms that were rooted in African music. And that's how Wish ends. It ends with that celebration note. But I'd like to think that this music reaches people in a way that they would not otherwise have empathy for. And with that, it's just, I'm just really blown away that transforming the poem into music and now into this new innovation of Magic Leap is happening. So we're seeing the story, we're seeing the history foretold in different ways that attract the listener. And so for that, I'm so grateful to you, Dr. Buchman, and I hand it off to you, Dr. Ibaka, to give us more insight. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for welcoming me to join this very exciting session. The splendid work of colleagues in the School of Music as well as in other departments. And thank you, special thank you to Jeffrey and Valerie for making me part of this project. I'm extremely excited about this project. I think it has the potential to speak to the anguish, to speak to the emptiness, to speak to the pain, to speak to the sense of dispossession and the attendant elements of discrimination that constitute part of the African diaspora experience. Steve Harvey says, I'm going to Ghana. Steve Wonder says, I am going to Ghana. Why? I think this Middle Passage project is extremely significant and is central to understanding and to help interrogate the whole diasporic experience. I mean, what is the Middle Passage? Some scholars and non-scholars focus on the leg of the journey from the coast of Africa on the other side of the Atlantic to the North American, Caribbean, or this side of the Atlantic. And I think what this project will help us to do is to interrogate the totality of the slave trade experience, taking it beyond the slave forts and castles of Ghana into the interior before even the journey to the coast began. And then, of course, the experience in the slave forts and castles and dungeons themselves, experiences that are as harrowing as one can imagine. And then take us right across the ocean into the New World, to the various ports on this side of the Atlantic, and then from the ports into the interior and beyond. And it is that totality that I think the project will help us to comprehend and appreciate and celebrate. And that is what is very exciting to me. I have not come across any project that speaks to the African American experience this way. And I think this has tremendous potential. And I'm just excited to be part of it this afternoon. Thank you.
You know, I wish we could see everybody in the applause, because I'm sure there's a lot of it. Thank you for this powerful presentation and this really important work. I think it reminds us of the privilege of being part of a university and how we can draw on the richness of the scholarship and the creative work and the innovative work with the technology that you all are exploring. What this space affords us. So thank you for that work. We have time for maybe one question. And I see applause in the question and answers, which is just great. I don't see a question just yet. And because, you know, maybe I'll pose the question so we don't have to wait for somebody to ask a question. I'm just wondering what's the next step for you in this process? What's going to happen, you know, post pandemic? What are your vision for some creative or scholarly or combined next step? Anyone?
Well, the first thing I'll say is that the next step is to involve artists, because, you know, so much of my work in creating opera productions is about bringing together huge collaborative teams. You go from the librettist, you know, the writer of the word, to the writer of the music, the composer, to the visual artist who creates the scenic world that we live within, to the costume designers, hair and makeup designers, lighting designers. There's so many really important collaborative spirits being added to the conversation. The next critical element for us is bringing in those visual creative voices and getting them to the heart of the story with us, so that we can make sure that we are crafting this experience in a way that honors the history as well as the empathy and vision for the way we hope to touch hearts and move people to a better place. So that really is our next step. I can say that we envision two models of what we're doing. One is being able to see Valerie performing this work in a concert hall and layering in all of these layers of animations around her, so that we really can connect to ancestral heritage as well as looking forward through the live performer, but then also creating a totally packaged virtual performance that can just go anywhere, and everyone in the world has the opportunity to experience that.
Thank you so much for that. I want to share there's more applause in the Q&A, and Professor Shannon Delatour said she can't wait to experience this performance, as can't I. I look forward to trying out those goggles sometime soon. We need to move on to our next presentation. Thanks again for this thought-provoking and moving work. So I'd like to introduce another professor from the Frost School of Music who has been engaged in research on working with children in K through 12 environments and beyond with special needs. And so I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Stephen Zdzinski.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am looking at a topic related to diversity, but in a very different sort of way. We're looking at learner diversity and some of the research that we've been doing here at the Frost School related to special learners in music. Today I'm going to just kind of give brief summaries of some of the faculty and student projects. If we have time, I'll mention the workshops and then try to draw some implication from the whole body of work of research that we've done at the Frost School. I'll start with a project I just presented last week at the National Association for Music Education Conference and previously at the International Society for Music Education Special Research Commission. And it's an article where I was tracing the history of special learner articles as found in the our flagship publication in music education, the Music Educators Journal. And so I was looking at this for trends in practice as well as trends of language and other primary events. So without going into much of the detail, I'll just give you some of the highlights of what I found and go on to the next project because my time's very limited today. In looking at the 173 articles over various eras, we saw in early 20th century special ed instruction in general and in music was done in intact special ed classes if they even existed, but primarily in residential settings. So in residential schools for people with who are blind, Gallaudet University comes to mind, other places like that. After World War II, we saw a huge shift, kind of at the dealing with all sorts of people who were disabled from World War II. At the same time, music therapy was really getting a foothold. So was special learner articles and practices were being expanded in schools. And all through the 1940s and 50s, we saw lots of articles on teaching music to students with various challenges, learning challenges. In the 50s and 60s, Brown versus Board of Education decision, followed by advocacy efforts by special learner advocacy groups, led to changes in the law. These changes in the law led to a number of articles that reflected the changes in practice and the changes in the law. So one thing to know, in the early 70s, the 94-142 Education for All Handicapped Children's Act mandated instruction in public schools for all students with special learning needs. Well, what we found, and this is a theme that will continue throughout all the stuff I'll be talking about today, is that music teachers had no clue as to what to do. And a large part of the articles in the 70s and the early 80s talked both about the law, but also talked about how do we deal with special learners as music teachers. We also saw as part of this article, changes in practice that were reflected in language. And for the sake of time, I'm going to skip through those right now. I can come back if we have time. So the remainder of the articles and the studies that we've done here at the Frost School are related to one of two things: either research by special learners on special learners themselves, individual special learner or disability categories, or of teachers of special learners. A study I published just last year, but actually completed a few years back, along with my wife, Dr. Susan Ireland, who's a director of outpatient neuropsychology at Jackson, who I have to admit I met through Dean Delatoile and mutual friends, and thank you to Dean Delatoile for introducing us. Anyway, we said we want to do a study together, and as it turned out, I had two doctoral students who had this condition called chromesthesia, which is kind of a multisensory perception where you hear color. You have a concurrent color sensation when you hear music. So we looked at the literature, and Dr. Ireland and myself decided, let's do a study where we combine an interdisciplinary study where we combine the previous music researcher research on chromesthesia and the neurologic and neuropsychological research on chromesthesia, both of which were rather naive to each other's expertise. So we combined the two expertise areas. We found that among the color associations with music, we replicated previous research with highly consistent associations between a certain pitch and a certain color in higher different hues for different octaves. And for each, we looked at two chromesthetic musicians. Their elicited colors were highly consistent, but highly idiosyncratic. So in other words, one person had very different associations than the other. We found lots of interesting associations and characteristics musicians with chromesthesia had in terms of similar to people with absolute or perfect pitch. They were also associated with emotional response. They could play by ear great. They had great pitch perception and memorization skills, but they couldn't transpose worth a damn. Now, how does this apply to special learner research is that in the neuropsychological testing part of the study, the neuropsychological tests identified a number of special learner characteristics: attention deficit disorder, so ADHD, social emotional self-regulations, organization or executive function, and sensory processing disorders, which were characteristics that we were able to identify as unique to these neurodiverse learners. Yet it didn't, so they had to deal with the challenges. That's a overriding theme as they go to the next slide here. Now, recent study that was just completed, defended in December by a PhD student, Shireen Husseini, looked at adult musicians with the learning disability, mathematics learning disability called dyscalculia. And Shireen herself had dyscalculia, so she used a qualitative approach, multiple case study with some autoethnography as well as part of the method to look at what are the impacts of having this as an adult musician. Now, I should mention Shireen's musicians with dyscalculia happen to be very, very successful in despite their challenges. And that's another theme that came through in a lot of the research we were looking at. negative impacts of dyscalculia included, of course, mathematics, physical and mental health, and self-esteem, but they found that teachers really could help and that they succeeded because of their own perseverance. They were stubborn. And as a result of having dyscalculia and their experiences with dyscalculia as teachers, many of them were teachers, they were more empathetic teachers. Now, the coping strategies that and I should mention, if you have dyscalculia, everyone thinks of this as a mathematics problem, but it's more than just math. It's also organization and time management and even being able to tell people directions. So in music, they had trouble reading music, memorizing music, and a rhythm and theory skills. Now, how did they approach this? What were the common coping strategies? Well, Shireen was able to identify multisensory learning and oral approaches, as well as one-on-one work with music teachers as things that help these people to succeed. So part of what we were trying to do with some of the research that we're doing throughout the various projects that have been done with special learner students as music students is to identify some of the strategies that appear to work. Another aspect of teaching special learners, and particularly K-12 settings, is the role of parents in the individualized educational program, where parents are a part of the team creating the individualized curriculum. And Valerie Coleman, another one of our PhD students who was interested in parent involvement, which is one of my primary research areas, she worked on a previously created model that I originated back in late 2006, and she pulled some of my elements and combined them and used them to create a structural equation modeling predictive model of what predicts school-based parent involvement, which is a watchword of parent involvement with special learners in music. She found that the background school values were very, very predictive of the parents' beliefs that their students could succeed. And this in combination with parents' impressions about music, and this included such things as their own background in music and attitudes about music, the combination of motivational beliefs and impressions about music were moderately strong predictive effects for school-based parent involvement, which as we're trying to get music teachers to be more involved, this kind of information can be very, very valuable. Two studies that are currently in progress and almost completed. We have a master's thesis. Marina McLaren, a band director from Texas, is conducting a study right now of middle school band and orchestra teachers who are hearing impaired. Now, some interesting results that she's found in her preliminary analysis of her survey project is that 81% of all of these teachers in her sample had taught at least one hearing impaired student in their career. The teachers had positive attitudes, and a majority, 62%, knew about the special learner laws that I've mentioned previously. However, the participants had little or no training in teaching hearing impaired students. Despite the fact that they hadn't had the training, they used teaching approaches that were effective in dealing with special learners who were hearing impaired, such as using an FM loop system or American Sign Language. They could identify the need for auditory assistance. But very telling in her project was these 29% indicating no involvement in helping to create the individualized education programs, despite the fact that most music teachers work with students including hearing impaired students, for multiple years, as classroom teachers may work with them for a single year at a time. The bottom line is they wanted the professional development, but 80% of the teachers in her study had no training. Now, another study, a DMA student in clarinet performance, Shannon McDonald, is in the last stages of her DMA essay, and she did a survey of applied clarinet teachers. Now, you should know that people who are collegiate level applied faculty members many times have not had a single special learner course or any training. Despite this, 78% of her sample of collegiate clarinet teachers indicated that they had students with special learning needs. And in red, you see the special learner categories from our K-12 laws, ADHD, autism, dyslexia, learning disability of dyslexia, who were the most commonly identified categories. Now, the clarinet teachers felt somewhat comfortable, and they felt that they could succeed, and they used common sense strategies. Without knowing what they were doing, they felt that they needed more training, and Shannon's advocating for more training. She's actually writing are you not seeing the slides?
Nope.
Huh, that's weird. I'm sorry. I've done the entire thing without showing the slides. Let me share the screen. I'm sorry about that. I would have shown the slides earlier. I'm sorry. Okay, so I can show the slides really quickly at the end, but know this, that the common practices that the clarinet teachers were mentioning were things that in special learner textbooks are very common practices, such as enlarged music, selecting repertoire. I always make the case in my special learners class that applied music teachers are already doing individualized education programs when they do private lessons, because they figure out what the strengths and weaknesses of the student are. They come up with repertoire to address the weaknesses, and they work on the strengths, which is part and parcel of what IEP has. So I thank you for mentioning that you were not seeing my screen. I'm going to skip this for now. I'm not sure how much time I have left, but let's just go to the implications here, and then I'll kind of zoom through the slides in case you want to see any of the other material that's on the slides. What's the bottom line with this body of research that we've done at the Frost School? Well, first of all, the history shows that there are changes in special learner practices, and it illustrates the need for music teacher training to deal with special learners and better understanding of special learners in music instructional situations. The studies that have been conducted by our faculty and students of students with special needs show that we can identify challenges and know that the challenges overlap in disability areas. We can also identify ways that these challenges can be mitigated. We also were able to identify that the challenges don't end at the end of the 12th grade of school. We have special learners in higher education as well. We know that there's a high instance of special learners. Both of these surveys had 80% approximately. We know that by and large, there's positive attitudes, but on the negative side, we have lack of knowledge. So we believe that additional training is important for both music pedagogy and music education students. And I can say that in my special learners class, I get a fair amount of DMA students as well as students that are in the master's in piano pedagogy, for example. Since you haven't seen the the other slides, I'm just going to zoom it all the way back up to the top because a couple of these things are worth seeing. And I apologize for not sharing the screen. I thought I had done that. I almost always do that. So chromesthesia, just a kind of a bottom line with the chromesthesia is if you see the colors that are associated with each of the keys of the piano, that's akin to what a chromesthetic musician with chromesthesia experiences. If you look at the dyscalculia slide here, I talk about the general challenges, musical challenges, and I'm happy to share the slides with anyone who's interested because it has a little more detail than what I had time to talk about during the presentation. And here, if you did not get a chance to see the model, you can see where school practices leads to motivational beliefs, and motivational beliefs and impressions about music lead to school-based parent involvement. And again, the hearing impaired and the DMA dissertation on special needs, and back to our implications. So that's my presentation. Happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you so much, Steve.
Yeah, sorry about not sharing.
We weren't sure. We were debating among the panelists whether you were going to share or not until you mentioned the slide. But thank you.
It's probably just as well. They were pretty boring slides.
It's important as a reminder that when we think about issues of equity and access and inclusion, that we're thinking of a wide variety of populations, and your work certainly has and the work of your students also has tackled a number of these questions. We don't have time right now, Steve, for question and answer.
I know I went over
a little bit. We want to make sure Brian Lynch has time.
Yeah, that's fine.
Those of you that are in attendance have some questions, and we have time at the end. We'll save them for the end. So again, thank you so much, Professor Jim.
That's fine. Bye-bye.
Now it's my honor to introduce our final presenter for today, Professor Brian Lynch. All yours, Brian.
Thank you, Carlos. Thanks. It's great to be here, and I just want to say it's been so edifying and inspiring to hear and know more about the projects of the other panelists, and it's a bit humbling to be in your company. So I feel like my presentation, I just hope it won't seem like an infomercial in comparison with what we've heard already. But I wanted to talk a little bit about a project that I did in 2019 during my sabbatical from the Frost School of Music, and this was the name of. Oh, let me share my screen here. Okay, hold on a second. Oh, got to do two things. So a window. Okay. All right. Can everybody see that? Yes. Raise a flag if you can. So the name of this project is called and project meaning recording or album, the On the American Book Club, my journey through literature in music. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the genesis of this project and the background. So the genesis was twofold. My urge to record a large jazz ensemble, otherwise known as big band project. I've recorded over 20 albums as a leader and recording artist, and literally been a part of hundreds of record albums in my decades of being on the music scene. But even though I've written big band arrangements and compositions in the past, I've never actually recorded any as a leader. So embarking on a whole album's worth of this was something that kind of was on my bucket list, and having the opportunity to with the sabbatical to spend a concentrated amount of time writing music was was too good to pass up. The other um, the other impetus was wanting to present a project with a definite theme reflecting that the times that uh, we're currently enduring, and make some sort of contribution to our present dialogue about inequality, inequity, race, progress, and reaction. Um, it's and of course, going into the pandemic is even sort of put another little thing on all of that. But a chance mention by a friend of mine who of a book that I had read nearly half a century ago, which is Albert Murray's The Omni-Americans, set off the connections in my head that gave me what I needed to put a theme together. I was going to say most of the music that I've recorded and that I've composed, I think has a theme, but it's never I've never really done too much except maybe with titles to really make a complete a complete project of a theme, and give the music an extra the project an extra musical message. And that was something I think, especially in this particular time, I wanted to do very much. And then also doing a large ensemble project, I think sort of suggests something that's put with the music. Anyhow, so the Omni-Americans, and remembering the role that that book had in my own journey as a person and as a musician as well, made me it made me think that maybe in my own personal story, as expressed through the books that have shaped me and my love of reading. So I've always been a very big reader, even as a child, and I thought that was a theme that I could feel to be really authentic and reflect myself as a person. Um, you know, and I came of age in the 1970s, which to me, in my lived experience, it was a decade bracketed at one end by protest, cultural tumult, and the hope of a transformed society, and at the other end of, in my own opinion, an arrival of a reactionary nostalgia, facilitating rapacity and injustice. I feel like this opposition seems to have defined most of my time on this planet, which is well over a half a century now. And the days we now lived in, I believe, are marked by an intensified struggle between oppositions of inclusion and exclusion, generosity and greed, love and fear. And I think the fate of the planet perhaps hangs in the balance of this struggle. My reading then and now centers around a love of learning, a search for knowledge, and a passion for understanding why things are the way they are and why they're not better. So, the writers that I chose to pair with the compositions that I wrote for this project are those whose work has had a special resonance for me during this particular time, whether I first read them many years ago or have more recently been exposed to them. The music of the Omni-American Book Club, beyond the specific dedications attached to each piece, is my heartfelt tribute to the many authors and myriad books that have changed my life and continue to help me make sense of the no sense of this life on earth. I hope through the project and through the music, I can expose musical audiences to the work of these books and their authors, and perhaps in return bring book lovers and those concerned with the issues addressed in these books toward the music and artists represented on this album. So let's take a look, and so this music was, and there's a little bit about me that we'll put over, and here it is. So this music managed to win a Grammy last year, and for Best Large Jazz Ensemble Album of 2019, and besides being nominated for Best Instrumental Composition from one of the tunes on the record. or compositions, I must say. Tunes is a sort of a, you can take the small ensemble out of the guy, but you can't take the guy out of the small ensemble. So, and that's a little bit about what I've just been talking about. So, the music itself was composed during my sabbatical in spring 2019, along with the orchestration and reorchestration of some music that I had previously composed. And I strive to not only use the themes of the book as an inspiration for the music, but also strove to, in many places, reflect them in my compositional procedures. I think in particular, there's a bit of dissonance on this record that maybe I haven't quite explored in my previous work. Certainly, I think that there are a lot of motifs and a lot of recurring procedures in the music that has to do with conflict and differing tendencies. As a for instance, in one of the tunes, where I go again with tunes, in one of the compositions, which is called "The Trouble with Elysium," which is dedicated to two writers on inequality and inequity in an environmental and economic way, Naomi Klein and Mike Davis, and also someone, the historian named Timothy Snyder. I used Timothy Snyder's idea of the politics of inevitability, which is sort of like the end of history, and the triumph of liberal democracy, and then the politics of eternity, which is identified with authoritarianism, and I portrayed those with two different kinds of musical structures and juxtaposed them in a sense of recurrence, which is the kind of the recurrence that goes on in the politics of eternity, and then the forward motion represented by the politics of inevitability. So getting back to the music, the music was tracked over 2 weeks in May 2019 at the Frost School of Music's Week Studio, and this was a project that very much involved every part of my Frost family and community. Frost School of Music faculty, current students, and alumni, along with members of the South Florida jazz and Afro-Caribbean music communities, took part in these sessions. After that, special guests were tracked in New York City, Pennsylvania, New Orleans, and Havana. Music was mixed and mastered in July-August of 2019, and the 2 CD length program of music was released by August 29th, 2019, which is the fastest turnaround time ever for one of my albums, and for the most complex project of my whole career to boot. The original artwork, actually, and I can show a little bit of that. Oh, here's a little bit. There's one of our first subjects here. Let me hold on a second here. Here's an example of the artwork. Original artwork was commissioned for this project from South Florida artist and longtime friend of both myself and my wife's, Robin D. Williams, and she's known for her blind drawing technique and her deep connection to music themes in her work, especially portraiture of musicians. So this is all work that's done with the blind drawing, sort of not looking at the paper when you're drawing. And I think she's quite incredible, and I think what she contributed to this project is really really fantastic and takes it into another sphere. So I'm just going to go really quickly. I'm going to play you a little bit of music from this. Maybe the best thing to do here is to play some of the music, which I've made a sort of a little montage with little fades and fade ups of one of the long compositions from this record, Crucible for Crisis, which is dedicated to David Levering Lewis, the historian, and the great W.E.B. Du Bois. And so history is one of the things that I think I get a lot out of reading wise, history and biography. Really, if you could categorize all the topics and the authors of the subjects of the Omni American Book Club, it centers around African American and Black literature and Black authors, and of course, a lot of those having to do with Black music and music of the African diaspora, and then topics of social justice, and history, having to do with themes of inequality, inequity, political themes, various things having to do with why things are screwed up out here. And again, these times feeling so much like they were when I was adolescent. I think there's this tremendous sense of we've been through this before and nothing got worked out, and now we're just even in more of a we have to dig ourselves out of a bigger hole here, but it must be done. Okay, so I'm going to play you excerpts from Crucible for Crisis, and we'll just maybe do a few slides while that happens. Okay. Thank you. So I know we're already probably out of time, so I'm just going to rifle through these and just give you an idea of some of the pairings here. And I have liner notes to this record that have a PDF version that has a link to my Bandcamp page, so you can listen to the whole record. So I'm going to put that in the chat or the Q&A, so everybody here can take a look at this stuff in depth, because there's definitely not enough time to go through all the enormity of the associations that these authors have had on me, and then the not to mention the artists that took part in this record. So the second cut, "The Struggle in Your Name," that's a phrase from from Ta-Nehisi Coates' book, and then also Albert Murray, whose On the Americans had a great impact on me when it first came out, when I was about 15, 16 years old. Somehow I came across that book in the public library, and it was one of the books that changed a lot for me. So, and okay, hold on here.
Brian,
Yep.
thank you so, Brian. I hate to cut you off because this is such great work, and
I know. Let me go through it just like this, so you just see who they all are.
I just want to make sure Aaron gets.
Brian, before you do that, I actually have to sign off, but I just wanted to thank Carlos for his genius in organizing, and for all of the panelists who participated today, for inspiring me in ways that I couldn't have anticipated. Your work all spoke to me very personally, and I'm sure to the broader audience. The breadth and depth of scholarship at Frost never ceases to amaze me. And I'm so excited about how you are really advancing scholarship and necessary dialogue around race and anti-Black racism. And Melvin, to you in particular, there's a lot of alignment between our own scholarship. So most of my early work, my foundational work, grew up in Little Haiti and Big Haiti. And so I so appreciate the cultural significance that your scholarship gives to the Haitian diaspora community. So thank you all so very much. Brian, I'm sorry to cut you off. I just wanted to reply because I felt like it would have been rude if I didn't do that. So very impressed. Thank you all. And we need to do this again.
Thank you so much, Aaron, for being with us. So we could keep this going a little longer. I was concerned because I know Aaron had to get to another meeting. And if somebody has to leave, everyone's welcome to leave. But before we continue the conversation, I just want to thank you all for sharing your important work. It reminds us of why we're here and what we do, and the valuable contribution that you bring to the world, but also to our students at the university. So thank you for sharing that work.
Thank you.
With us. So we have any comments, questions? Brian, do you want to add a little something?
I actually got a lesson to teach.
Oh, okay.
I was going to ask, can I ask a quick question?
Sure.
If there's time. So Brian, I think this is just an unbelievable, amazing project. I just wondered, to what do you attribute this, not only your love of reading at such an early age, but the reading selections, these African-American authors. I mean, for like a white guy growing up in the Midwest, in the late 60s, 70s, for example, you seem like something of a rare bird. I mean, and I just wondered if you could comment on who influenced you to you said you just came across them, but I think that there's got to be something more, right?
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, maybe I was, maybe I don't know, maybe I wasn't. I mean, I know that when I started getting interested in music for real, it was because it came out of, I mean, the era that I came to intellectual came to consciousness in was one where a lot of things were happening. So we were involved in student protest. We were involved with interaction with radicals, not only, you know, white radicals, but black radicals like the Panthers, and all this stuff was around in the culture. And there was definitely a sense that 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 the music, you know, and you know, by the way, there were naming controversies about the word jazz 50 years ago too, right? Not just now. So again, it's like it goes round and around, and nothing really happens, you know. And it can be a great disappointment to have lived through that decade where I think we were really naive, but we thought that things were going to start getting solved, you know. And of course we were naive, and we didn't even, and that someone like myself didn't even have even a sense of some of the subtleties of how the thing works that we do now because of the contributions of all the intellects and the critical theorists and everybody from that point on there. But I think that between, you know, there was always a connection between reading for me, and then there's where the world was, and there's where that's what was out there. And then when you connect that with music, so to me, opening up to the music of say like John Coltrane or Miles Davis or the Art Ensemble of Chicago or you know, Ornette Coleman, and then Charlie Parker and Bud Powell and so on and so forth. That was inseparable to reading, you know, Amiri Baraka or A.B. Spellman or the autobiography of Malcolm X or Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man or Albert Murray's Omni Americans, along with other, you know, other books of social critique. You know, I mentioned, for instance, I don't know, you know, Eric Hobsbawm's work at all?
Oh yeah. Sure.
Yeah, so he's somebody who's got a special place for me, you know, in a number of ways. I mean, and kind of come to find out a lot of things about, you know, actually a lot of his subjects. He's a very unusual person, I think, for coming from the background that he came from, but he came from a very unique background too. And come to find out, he was a jazz nut and actually even a jazz critic under a pseudonym, you know. So all those connections are just the connection between. I wouldn't call myself it. I mean, I'm not. You know, I work as an academic, but I'm not really an academic. I'm, you know, just kind of a bebop trumpet player. You know, but I mean, but my love of the way that information through music and information through words and speech go together. And this is something that I find very much lacking in the education that music students get even today, and something that I really kind of devote myself to trying to foster in my students, along with the notes and tones, you know, to
Thank you.
paraphrase another really important book, you know.
Yeah.
But thank you for asking that. I mean, I think that it's just common sense if you're interested in something that you have to like. You have to learn about the culture of the people who made the music. There was never any controversy or any kind of doubt about that this wasn't black music when I came up. That was a settled subject, but also it was still a unitary music in a sense, in a way that it kind of split apart, you know.
Yeah.
And I would situate 1980 as the point where that happened too.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
Well, thanks again, everyone. We are you have a lesson, and
David's like, probably, where'd he go?
I really appreciated Melvin and Steve and Brian, and I know Valerie and Jeffrey and Barca had to go, but it was so wonderful. If you have other ideas for other talks you want to do, I'm so thrilled to share with the wider University of Miami community. There are points, I mean, the idea here is to engage us in conversation and find points of intersection where we find people who are kindred spirits in other departments that we didn't know were working on certain projects, and we work together, you know, in interdisciplinary teams to do things like we saw with the interdisciplinary team today. It's propels us forward. So anyway, I want to thank everyone and everyone in attendance. Thank you, Ali. Thank you, Eva, for doing all the organization for this talk. And I look forward to the next time we get together and have a conversation about research. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks,
Have a
Thank
Carla.
you.
good day.
Yeah.